Welcome back to another episode of the Braun Performance and Rehab Podcast, powered by ISOFIT, Oro Muscles, and Firefly Recovery. ISOFIT is my go-to for all things isometric strength training. For more on ISOFIT, be sure to check out isofit.com. Oro Muscles revolutionizes rehabilitation with real-time actionable insights into muscle activity with live biofeedback and instant analysis, which has made a huge impact in my work with athletes. For more on Oro, be sure to check out oromuscles.com. Episodes like this are made possible by Firefly, the official recovery provider of the Braun Performance and Rehab Podcast. For more on Firefly, be sure to check out recoveryfirefly.com. Joining me today on the podcast is Missy Mitchell-McBeth. Missy and I dive into volleyball strength and conditioning considerations, in particular more on the conditioning side in this conversation today. Really great episode. Really appreciate Missy's time. Highly recommend you check out all the amazing work that she's doing, in addition to the book that she wrote, diving into some of these concepts that we discussed today in a little bit more detail. Enjoy. Missy, welcome to the podcast. I'm super excited to work with you today. I really appreciate your time and you being here. For people who might not be familiar with you and all the incredible work you've done in the space, in particular around the sport of volleyball, would you mind filling them in a little bit about who you are and all the amazing things you got going on?
Yeah, so I'll start with where I'm at now and then kind of walk you through background. So I am currently operating my own business, Missy Mitchell-McBeth Sports Performance, where I do primarily coaches education. But as part of that, I also serve as the Director of Sports Performance for a volleyball club in the Dallas-Fort Worth metro area. So I work with about 20 teams, 200 athletes, and then manage a staff of there's 3 to 4 of us. One of our staff members actually is overseas playing professionally right now, which is awesome for her. Prior to that, and I also have a day job, I work for the equipment company Powerlift in sales, serving the state of Texas. So those things keep me busy. Previously, I was a full-time high school strength coach at Byron Nelson in the Trophy Club area, which anyone in the volleyball space is familiar with that program. Earlier in my career, I was at TCU for 7 years, working primarily with women's basketball, women's volleyball, and women's golf. And then way back when I started off as a high school volleyball coach slash biology teacher, which is kind of how I got into strength and conditioning as I got thrown in charge of the weight room and had it forced on me. And so I had to go learn about strength and conditioning so that I could apply it to my athletes. Figured out that I liked it, wanted to do it full time, and then took that path.
That's incredible. And you get like 8 to 9 hours of sleep every night with all that going on too?
Totally. And my diet's perfect as well. So
My goodness, man, you've got everything put together. And that's such a unique journey, kind of having that biology background and then finding your way into strength and conditioning through sport that way. So it sounds like volleyball came well before strength and conditioning did for you then?
it did. I played collegiately. It was an NAIA school at the time. So it's just kind of, and I still play now. I play beach volleyball. I don't play competitively anymore. There was a time in my early 30s when I was traveling and attempting to compete in tournaments, but now we just do it for fun. So volleyball's just kind of always been my first love. And I've kind of found the unique opportunity to blend that with career opportunities, which at first, coming from the collegiate level, like I loved doing it at that level, but then moving to the high school level, I was working with all sports. So I didn't really want to pigeonhole myself into volleyball because I thought that, if I'm an athlete on the soccer team, like I don't want to work with someone that I don't think understands my sport. So I kind of would get where people were like, we want you to come talk at this clinic about volleyball. I'm like, no, 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 no. I'm going to come talk about football or whatever topic it was. So it took really like me getting beaten over the head with, hey, this is what your audience wants to hear from you for me to actually come around to the fact that, oh, well, I love the sport. I'm knowledgeable in the sport. Let's go ahead and do this thing. So it wasn't necessarily a choice early on, even though it should have been. It was more something that just kind of, I don't want to say fell into my lap, but that's just where the course got steered.
Yeah, definitely. Did you have like a robust strength and conditioning like program when you were playing volleyball yourself that way? Or, did you never really get exposed to that when you were an athlete yourself?
My exposure in high school was I think we would do about 6 weeks in the weight room intermittently. I can remember as a freshman, we'd missed a bunch of serves. So obviously the solution to that was that, if that was a Tuesday night game, Wednesday we went in and did a lot of bench press because that's gonna making your athletes super sore. Is really, really going to help the serving situation. So I really didn't have a great background in it. Even collegiately, like I said, we were NAIA, so I was going to muscle and fitness magazines and like clipping workouts. I mean, I'm 43, so like the internet wasn't quite the resource that it was, which is both a good and a bad thing, right? But I was clipping things out of magazines to try to figure out workouts for myself. So I didn't get a good handle on what strength and conditioning should really look like for an athlete until I was coaching volleyball and started working with the strength coach there on campus. His name's Reb Brock. We've been friends now for 20 years. And he was my mentor and was kind enough to take me under his wing and, show me resources, like direct me towards getting my CSCS. And then I just kind of rolled from there.
Yeah, no, I like that. I like that a lot. So how did you kind of like develop that framework that you use now to program for the volleyball athletes you work with, but also teach other coaches like how to kind of develop their own programs for volleyball athletes? Does that come very much from that individual you just mentioned, his work that way, or did you kind of develop your own, or what does that kind of framework, if you will, look like for you?
It kind of looked like screwing a lot of stuff up for a long time, and then figuring out what worked. So, moving from where I was kind of just throwing together programs based on mimicking what he was doing at the high school level and doing that for a couple years to then going into a master's degree program that was specifically tailored towards strength and conditioning and learning some more principles there and working with some programming in that aspect and then being handed as an intern at TCU, I was given a team like by myself. They were like, you've coached for 4 years. Full transparency, the coach is really difficult to work with. None of our staff members will do it. You got it. So it was like all of a sudden I get thrown golf, which is like a precision sport, right? That's a fine motor skill sport. And so, then it's like, well, I have to learn not just how to appropriately train a golfer, but how to speak to them in a language that motivates them to do things in the weight room. And then, as I proved myself there, like I ended up getting hired on full time. And so and then I was very fortunate that Zach Dakent was there. And so I was learning a lot from him in that first, internship phase. And then even when I was a paid intern the next semester, and then, just tons and tons of reading, research, talking to other people. I just kind of built out my training philosophy over time. And then now what I use, what I teach, which is the basis for the book that I wrote, is we have all these strength and conditioning textbooks, but then you're put in a situation where you don't have enough equipment, you don't have enough time, you have a developmental athlete, and then you have a Division I athlete in the same room. How are we going to address all of those needs simultaneously? So I kind of tried to build a framework for coaches' education that takes strength and conditioning concepts and simplifies them and makes them more practical. I think a lot of times there's gatekeeping in the strength and conditioning industry of like things have to be done this way or, this specific exercise is for this outcome. And I think we're doing sport coaches a disservice by kind of having that narrative and not teaching them like, hey, like if your situation is that you only have 3 squat racks, but you've been told that squat has to come first because that's your strength exercise for the day, like you may have to switch the order of operations and things. You have to do what works best for your setting. So I guess my overall framework has now come from less perfect programming principles and more practicality, which, wow, what an alliteration there.
So you mean to tell me that it's not all about just putting a perfect program together? And oh, by the way, we also might need to individualize our programming based on the athlete's level and their past training history and so on that way. And we can't just like, copy paste a perfect program together from what we see on Instagram and it's just going to work for everyone. Like it just seems like such a crazy concept, right? Like, I think a lot of times people get into this space, and I'm probably guilty of it myself too, where it's like, you get into this space, you write out everything, and you're like, oh, this is great. And then your athlete can't do half of it, or your facility doesn't have it, or, you're also contending with like 20 other people in the facility, and half the stuff that you planned on actually isn't available when you wanted it. And it's like now you have to like be able to think on the spot almost and use what I call that like like coachability, if you will, where, this is not something you're going to get in like an AI algorithm or anything. It's like your ability to literally adjust on the fly to people in the moment. That way, I think is so valuable. But as you mentioned, it's even better if you have a framework that just accounts for that from the start, as opposed to just kind of figuring it out as you go, if you will.
Yeah, and I think that the number of programs that I've thrown in the trash after the first day is much greater than the ones that have been perfectly executed, right? So like even last night I was installing a new exercise and I was watching my athletes perform it. And I was like, nope, should have started with, this progression first and then gone to it. So it's like, okay, just modify it for the next time, right? So it's like you do have to work on the fly. Not everything that looks great on paper isn't always going to work. So I think that's a really great point that you made. That like, yeah, it's people. That's one of the reasons I don't sell like 6-week training programs. And there's nothing wrong. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with people doing that. I think sometimes it's helpful to view those things, but you have to learn what works for your setting and be able to make those modifications.
Yeah, 100%. And I think that, we've talked about volleyball on the podcast in the past. And one of the things that tends to come up is just how important strength and conditioning is for volleyball athletes for a variety of different reasons. But I'm interested to hear your thoughts. Why is it that strength and conditioning is so important for volleyball? Is there one thing in particular that like volleyball has that other sports might not have that make your work even more important? And is there like a real performance benefit to getting stronger and getting in better shape? I feel like I already know the answer to that, but I feel like I got to throw it out there to you too. I want to hear your thoughts more about like why is it that strength and conditioning might be so important for the volleyball athlete?
One, it's important for all athletes. I think we can agree, but the topic is volleyball. And I want to speak directly to the like middle school and high school levels. I haven't been in the collegiate space for the past 9 years. So I'll leave that to the current collegiate strength coaches. But as a starting point, like I want to talk about, because I know we're primarily focusing on conditioning here. There are scenarios in which I would not implement a conditioning program with volleyball athletes. And that's when, we've all gone through our phase of we need to let practice be conditioning, right? And we're not going to do anything outside of that. But we've got to prepare athletes for practice from both a strength and a conditioning standpoint. So with middle school, with high school athletes, they are playing year round and they are playing a sport where you have to repeat a high output over the course of potentially a 5-set match. And the thing with the sport of volleyball is that I have to win the last set. It's not football where if I blow somebody out in the first half and get a big enough lead, like I stand a pretty good chance, right, in the second half. Like maybe I can lose the second half and still win the game, right? If I lose the final set of the match in volleyball, I've lost the match, right? It can come down to the last 2 points. So my ability to be accurate and be precise with my movements, that's really, to me, it's critical for volleyball athletes. And being strong, being resilient, being well conditioned in those final stages of the match, I think gives you a leg up on a competitor. I think the other thing is not just, you have to repeat high outputs across a game, but you also have to repeat high outputs. If you're playing a club tournament, like our kids are about to go to a 3-day club qualifier in New Orleans, they might be playing 10 or 12 matches across a 3-day time period. So if they don't have some type of capacity to handle that, they're going to be absolutely gassed towards the end of a tournament. And then they're using altered movement patterns. Their arm's so sore, their arm's so tired, they can hardly lift it. Well, they're going to use something to swing. So now all of a sudden they're swinging and using their back, or using too much of their shoulders. So I think that, if we don't have some base of strength, we don't have some base of conditioning, we're setting them up not just for suboptimal performance, but also for a potential injury. And then I think the last one is volleyball, the timing on volleyball, right? Like if you're a high school volleyball coach in Texas, I'll speak to Texas specifically. You basically get 3 days of practice and then you go play your first scrimmage. And then the following week, you have a match on Tuesday, and then you have a tournament Thursday, Friday, Saturday. If they have not been doing strength and conditioning, the whole concept of playing into shape, they don't have time to play into shape. because they have a match within, 10 days of the start. So I think just kind of those different factors, the sheer volume, the timing of the sport, I think make year-round strength and conditioning a really critical component of volleyball players' success.
Yeah, such great points there, Missy. And just to kind of run it back, as you mentioned, in general, when thinking about the high school, middle school athlete in volleyball, it sounds like they have very little time to prep and ramp up for their season from the start of practice. They're doing a lot of high workload, high demand type activities. And as you mentioned, it's a lot of repetitive, high force and fast force outputs, right? Like they're not swinging their arm super slow or anything. It's really hard, it's really fast. And it's not just the arm swing, as you mentioned there with the shoulder, but also like the jumping, the landing, all these other things that way. And there's certainly a fatigue element that plays into all of that. And I know a lot of times in like traditional strength and conditioning, I'll say we emphasize those outputs so heavily, right? We want people stronger, we want them jumping higher, and those are important, but I also want them to be able to repeat that hundreds and hundreds of times because if they can only jump their max height twice, and then they're fatigued and they're out for the rest, then they're not going to last long in 4 or 5 sets of volleyball, unfortunately. You need to have the ability to repeat that over and over and over again. It's not necessarily thinking about force development, but more of like force fatigue, I would say, if you will, that way. And I feel like volleyball as a sport would be complex from a conditioning standpoint because, as you mentioned, you've got multiple stimuli that you need to hit. You need almost like a upper body conditioning, if you will, just from the volume of arm swings they might be taking, which I'd imagine that practice can play into that a certain amount. You also need a high volume of like plyo contacts, I would imagine, but I also think that plyo is not necessarily what we would consider conditioning, or maybe plyo should be considered in conditioning that way. I know that's debated quite a bit, but it's like we have so many different demands and so many different parts of the body that we need to, develop from a energy system standpoint that the demands of the sport are so unique that you can't just tell these kids to go run 3 or 4 miles and call it conditioning. It's not going to carry over the same.
Yeah, so I think kind of targeting, conditioning for volleyball, and I'm going to speak very broadly because the great thing about working with middle school and high school athletes is that your program can be relatively non-specific and you can make a lot of progress with them. So, the first thing that we're going to look at, and this is a piece that I think is missing from a lot of programs, period, but specifically from volleyball, is lower intensity conditioning. And people are going to immediately think of that and equate it with long distance running. And that's not it at all, because that's actually going to fall for most people into the category of medium conditioning or medium intensity conditioning. So what we're targeting there is we're targeting central adaptations, so adaptations to the structure of the heart itself. So we're looking for eccentric left ventricular hypertrophy, which you're not going to get from higher intensity training. Okay. So we're going to get improved cardiac output from that, which is going to send more oxygen to the working tissue. And again, that's going to be using low intensity methods. And so that's the first area that I'm going to attack. Because number one, we can use that, again, that physiological adaptation to the heart. I think that our athletes should probably be more healthy as a result of the things that we do with them, not less. Number two, you can actually do a really great job facilitating recovery with that. So, like, I'll use lower intensity conditioning sessions in the high school setting if we're coming in on a Saturday for practice and we need to get them moving before a serve and pass or whatever, or even, they want to do something instead of just watching film that day. Like we might do a really general either aerobic mobility or cardiac output circuit. So we're getting them moving, we're getting blood flow, we're hopefully keeping it low enough intensity where we're creating that volume overload of the heart and creating that adaptation over time. I'll also use it like Mondays after a club tournament. When my kids come in Monday night, like that's usually our sprint night. We're timing sprints. We're doing some, more intensive plyos. Well, if they came in gassed from a club tournament, I'm not going to get much from a speed perspective. I'm not going to get much from a plyometric perspective, but instead I can still get them moving because they're still going to have practice. So we can go through one of those circuits. And it's like I'm kind of killing two birds with one stone. The other end of the spectrum is you need some higher intensity stuff. And one, obviously, as you mentioned, we're going to spend the majority of our time attacking speed, power, and strength because you have to improve like the nervous system. You have to improve their ability to tolerate mechanical stress, right? That both of those things tie into conditioning. If those two things are more efficient, I'm going to last longer. If my movement quality is better, if I'm stronger. But what I see a lot of in volleyball practice is that coaches love to make practices, quote, hard. But what they think hard is actually high volume and what ends up being moderate intensity. So then you take those athletes and you put them in a game at game speed, and they're really not prepared. They're really actually just fatigued. They haven't actually operated a lot of times at game speed. They're not swinging as hard. They're not as amped up. They're not moving as quickly because practice, no matter how you slice it, practice is never a game, right? You can put tons of constraints in place and all that kind of stuff, and you can make it as close as you can. But ultimately, we need to do something to check that high intensity box. So that's where we're looking at more, ability of muscles to handle mechanical stress, but also metabolic stress. So speed, power, strength workouts, but also some more specific types of conditioning. And you mentioned plyos. I think that's where deep tier plyometrics can be a great asset from a conditioning standpoint. And like people take the stance of like plyos can never be conditioning, and that's 100% accurate. Like if your idea on a plyo or your intent with a plyo is I'm trying to have a maximal output, then of course it's not appropriate for conditioning. But something like a deep tier where you're yielding, to force and you have that like nice contract relax cycle, like that's something that's happening repetitively on the volleyball court. And so I think it's a great usage of that resource to build that into our conditioning in something that's a little bit more specific, because I can get on a bike and I can do intensive tempos and that's all well and good, but there's going to be at some point there's going to be limited transfer. To your point about the arm swing specifically, I will die on the hill of yes, we can get stronger. Yes, we can use elastic energy, through rotational power through our core to kind of preserve our shoulders. But at the end of the day, like there is no substitute for getting your arm shape swinging at a ball. And that needs to be progressed in over time. I can tell you from a number of scenarios in my life when it hasn't been, and I've not, we've had to do most volleyball players know the second day of practice where you have to flip upside down to take your shirt off because you can't actually lift your arm up overhead. Sometimes, and I'm not advocating for that model, but there's no substitute. It's just like baseball. Like they need to do a throwing program to get back in shape for throwing.
I like that analogy comparing to baseball, but with that in mind too, I'd imagine, I talk about this with baseball guys all the time, how I don't necessarily want my baseball athletes to do 500 reps of random band exercises before they start throwing. Same thing is true for volleyball. I consider volleyball just as much of an overhead sport as baseball or some of these other sports that way. And I don't necessarily think we need to do 500 to 600 reps of every band exercise ever to like prep and prime our shoulder for arm swing. It's like, at the end of the day, I think you need to progress the volume like you mentioned. But also like you got to keep the main thing for lack of a better way to put it. And, me spamming a bunch of this kind of random stuff is not going to help me with the actual arm swing in game that way, I would think. And, I like how you brought up too just the overall like concept of that deep tier plyo from like a conditioning standpoint, because I think that a lot of times when we train plyos, we actually miss that range. And you're right, we spend so much time there anyways in the sport of volleyball. It's like, why don't we use that? And then we kind of get like the double benefit of the conditioning and the plyo contact in that range that we often miss. And even to your point too about just the overall like cardiovascular health, like that's not really talked about enough in the strength and conditioning world, right? It's like we want these athletes to be healthy and successful well beyond their time in front of us. It's not just about how can they get their highest performance now. We also have to keep in mind, like, hey, I kind of want them to be an athlete in 5 to 10 years. I kind of want them to be a healthy person in 5 to 10 years. I want them to fall in love with that process of self-improvement through exercise that they might not be able to get through any other disciplines in life in today's day and age, right? It teaches you so much. And I think the more we can foster that kind of like healthy relation and healthy benefit, the better off they're going to be long term.
Yeah, and the other piece I didn't touch on with the lower intensity conditioning piece is, you know, a lot of what we do from a training standpoint is fight or flight mode, right? We're always like ramping up the sympathetic nervous system. That lower intensity conditioning can actually help us restore balance to the autonomic nervous system. So by that alone, they're going to recover better. They're going to sleep better because they're more fit. And I think that that's something that people really overlook with that piece because they're afraid of it. And like I said, I'm not always able to use this. If it comes down to me sacrificing a speed, power, strength workout for a conditioning workout, it's not going to happen because I know that there's a chance that we might play into shape. There is no chance that we're going to play into strength, play into better movement patterns, right?
Right.
That's probably not going to happen. So if I have to make if I have to make the sacrifice, unfortunately, I will sacrifice the conditioning piece. But I think that people have gone so far in the direction of speed, power, strength that they've forgotten that, hey, like there's a whole nother side of strength and conditioning. It's conditioning, you know?
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And, as you mentioned, a lot of times that conditioning comes from this just low intensity volume in practice that way. And I would imagine there's quite a balancing act that has to occur when you're writing a strength and conditioning program, emphasizing the conditioning there with the actual sport that the athlete does, their coaching style, what their typical practice looks like, and so on that way. And just to give a, practical example of that real quick, there was a girl I was working with PT for lower back pain, which I'm sure never happens in volleyball athletes, but they were doing about 4 hours of practice a night, and she was like, "Yeah, that's just kind of our norm." And to me, 4 hours of practice sounds like crazy, but to them, that's what they do. And I would imagine, now I never went to a practice myself, but I would imagine there was a point in that time where the intensity dropped, the skill demand dropped, and it was just more volume, more volume, more volume, right? Same thing as if you went to the gym for a 4 hour marathon lifting session, right? You're not going to keep high intensity the entire time. There's going to become a point where things drop off and your volume just becomes junk volume, right? That's when I switch my workout over to arm farm instead of hitting heavy squats, for example, right? So with that in mind, like, we had all this volume coming in, and it was like, I had to kind of adjust my own approach with this athlete because she was already doing a lot. So it's like, how do I add little things in to address the problem we're here for, but also not overcook it when we're already doing so much that way? And I'd imagine that same balance comes in with conditioning. It's like, well, they're already burning so much, they're already doing so much. It's like, I just need a little bit of a stimulus for this, but not too much to overcook it. And I think your point too on the fight or flight was really awesome there as well, because you're right, these athletes get stuck in that mode sometimes. And it's like sometimes the best way to get them to throttle up is to teach them how to throttle down every now and then.
Yeah, and I think that that was one of the most challenging pieces for me of moving from the collegiate setting to the high school setting, and then even another layer of moving into the private sector, right? So, like collegiate setting, I'm at every practice. I'm having a weekly meeting with the coach. Whether I agree with their practice plan or not, I know exactly what it is. I know what buckets are full. I know exactly, what stimulus to apply. Move to the high school setting, right? Now all of a sudden it's like I'm not at practice because I'm with another team. So I'm relying on coach to accurately assess their of intensity for the day, which I think we can all agree that sport coaches are really poor at that. I've had coaches tell me that since a practice was like basketball, since it was non-contact, it was easy. And I had like heart rate data and the kids were like over 92% for like 40% of practice or something like that. And I was like, hello, like not at all what you thought it was. And then, when you move from the high school setting into club season, now it's like you have this other thing happening in these athletes' lives, maybe 4 hours a night outside of the school, that I'm now relying on a 16-year-old kid, a 17-year-old kid to tell me, hey, I'm tired, we need to back off, that kind of stuff. So I think that, yeah, like you said, sometimes there does have to be the whole minimum effective dose thing. Just from the perspective of a lot of these kids don't have the capacity to handle more. And so, like, we have to go pretty minimal on the volume, whether it's from a conditioning standpoint, like in the scenario that you're just talking about, where that athlete's practicing 4 hours a night, multiple days a week. we're probably not going to condition even if they need it, because again, that's just stacking more and more volume. So I think that you have to take everything on a case by case scenario and not try to apply like the blanket 6 week conditioning program or blanket 6 week lifting program, because that's just not going to work for every situation. And so that's where I think you just need to approach everything from the basis of principles. And then that way you have that to guide the way.
Yeah, no, I like that. I like that a lot. And I think that principles-based approach is often missed, or at least in my experience, it was missed. Now, I feel like I've hopefully had a fairly unique educational background compared to, a lot of other individuals in the space, but I graduated college with a degree in exercise science and never once had a training and conditioning class. Never
Hmm.
once actually taught how to take things from textbook and actually put it together in a program. So I think that that concept of principles first when it comes to conditioning is so, so essential because, as you mentioned, it's not just about throwing more volume on and calling it conditioning. It's about what stimulus does this person in front of me actually need? And then how can I go about delivering that? And as you mentioned earlier, all of these athletes are different. They're all unique. So how I approach it for one athlete might be different than the next. And maybe they're on the same team and they're the same age and I'm approaching it differently, right? It's all about understanding what stimulus do they need? How can I apply it to them in a way that's actually going to, be accomplished and drive what I'm after? And then if I can check those two boxes, then it's just a matter of being consistent with it. Because I think that's the other element to conditioning that I see a lot of athletes struggle with is, they'll come to me and they'll start talking about what they're doing and they'll condition really good for a month. And then they fall off the wagon and all of a sudden they're not doing anything that they were doing for another month. And then it's like, oh, I got to get back in shape. So they start doing all the stuff they were doing before, which was great, but they stopped and then they restarted. And it kind of becomes this like conditioning yo-yo effect that I see sometimes, if you will, that way. And I'm not 100% sure why it occurs, but I think ultimately, if you keep the stimulus, even if it's a lower intensity and a lower volume, if you're just consistent with it, I think that consistency will get you notably further than if you're constantly starting and stopping.
So that's like my entire like shtick behind high school strength and conditioning for volleyball specifically is that right there. So, like I said, Byron Nelson, people will recognize that name in the volleyball space because we had was it 2018 or 2019, we won state. We were the number one team in the nation. They just won state this past year. They will probably win state again. Like it is a fantastic program, and so when I was working with them, I would just have people, oh, what are you guys doing? What are you guys doing? It's like, well, what we're doing is I got 5 D1 kids on the floor, one of whom just played for a national title and is now playing professionally. So what I did is I kept them healthy
Yeah.
and I manage that training volume. So it's like that's the recipe because if I can keep those 5 kids and their little supporting cast of role players healthy, we're going to go beat the brakes off everybody. Like I don't care how great their jump training program or whatever it is, like we're just better. Which not to diminish the importance of strength and conditioning, but that's just the reality of life. But my volume and my in season versus off season programming looked relatively similar because when they were in our quote off season, they were still in club season. And I think that that's one thing that people miss the boat on from, a comprehensive strength and conditioning perspective, but also from a conditioning perspective of, hey, just because you don't see them at practice that night doesn't mean that it didn't happen. And so what I think happens specifically with conditioning, I had to address this with a coach this year. She was like, my kids are, I'm doing extra conditioning with them because they're tired. They can't make it through drills. And I'm like, okay, first of all, if a kid can't make it through the workload that's been placed in front of them, the last thing that they need is additional workload. They actually need probably less. They probably need greater rest intervals so they can, I don't know, work on like technical, tactical aspects of the game, like not under fatigue. And then what's really going on with your kids is that they're in off season at school, so they're getting mowed over there. Then they're coming to practice and you're mowing them over because they're out of shape because they're tired from school. And so you assess them as out of shape, and then you send them back to school and they get assessed once again as out of shape. So that coach conditions the piss out of them. And then they come back to you and the cycle continues. So I think that that is a huge mistake on the, high school strength and conditioning front as a whole, volleyball specifically, and the conditioning piece is that people they don't account for the volume that's occurring outside of their program. And that can be really challenging for me in my current role because if I have a club team of 12 athletes, I've got some kids that are doing very little at school. I have some kids that are doing nothing at school. I have kids that are homeschooled, and that's the only workout they get for the day. So it's like I've got to try to figure out a workout that addresses the needs of everybody without, just absolutely obliterating some of them with volume.
Right, right. And it's that never-ending game of how much is enough and how much is too much. And I think the other piece that goes into that too is what's enough for them one day might be too much for them the next that way. I've certainly seen a decent amount of athletes that way who, have come in different times and maybe they didn't eat that day or whatever it is. And it's like, the work that they can tolerate that day is significantly lower than the other days that way. So it's like plain and simple. I think it's just a matter of being able to modify what you do in the moment, if you will, to the person in front of you. And I know I brought that up earlier, and maybe that wasn't worded the best, but plain and simple, like understand that especially with the middle school and high school athlete, they're very volatile and they change rapidly. So what works one day might not work the next day.
Volatile might be the most perfect word I've ever heard to describe a middle school athlete.
Yeah, that was the best thing that could come to mind to me in the moment that way. And it's just like it's just they have so many different stressors that they're undergoing. There's so many things in life that are happening at that age that it's like plain and simple. You just have to keep into account what you're doing with them. And I like to use the analogy. I use this a lot that it's really difficult to burn things when they're in the slow cooker. If you throw it on the stove and you turn it on high, guess what? You can burn it overnight. I had a roommate in college who would always cook his eggs on high and he burnt the hell out of them all the freaking time. He never learned. But if you put it on low, you can get pretty far, pretty quickly and not have to worry about doing too much. I think that approach works so well for conditioning, as you outlined, right? It's like, we need to do these things consistently. We need to keep them available. But ultimately, if we just do a little bit every single time and not worry about, oh my gosh, well, they need more, they need more, they need more. It's like, no, we just need enough to drive the adaptation that we're after. And once we've checked that box, we can actually pump the brakes and then just progress it the next time they're in.
Agreed. And that's my assistant and I were actually talking the other day about, in the last, I think, 8 years, aside from I've got some kids that come in, like I've got one that's been training with me consistently multiple times a week since last winter. So 2024, 2023, winter of 2023, right? So it's like I can stack some volume on her and she can handle it because she's been trained to handle it, right? And
Right.
so that's where I think, like, to your point of just a little bit here, a little bit here, a strength and conditioning coach's perspective, and like even I had this mindset coming to the high school level. My mindset was always like progression, more, like more intensity, more volume, more something. And then it's like I got to the high school level and I was like, okay, we can't always add more. So sometimes we have to look at the concept of accumulation. So we have to accumulate quality training over time. And as much as like you always want to, either decrease work interval or increase, increase work interval or decrease rest interval or increase overall session volume and conditioning. Sometimes it's like you kind of just come in because you have the same amount of time and you're doing a very similar workout week to week. And as I was telling him, I was like, that can make you feel like you're not making progress. I'm like, but the end result is after I had those kids for 4 years and then they went on to the collegiate setting, like some of them were very successful. So it's like where I looked at it and I'm like, they probably needed more work capacity. They probably needed to be stronger. They probably needed more of this. That just wasn't the reality and what we could accomplish. But what I gave them was the ability to move really well, and handle some more volume and kept them healthy so that they were able to go and train at a higher level, once they hit the college setting.
Yeah, and to that point as well, I don't know if you've noticed this or not, but I've started to notice now that I've been training consistently in the gym for over 10 years, I can just kind of go back in and maybe I haven't benched in a week or two, but I'm able to go in and bench a pretty similar weight to what I was doing for pretty similar amount of reps that way. And I think that there's something to be said about just doing that long-term development model and just doing those things consistently for a long period of time where it's like eventually your body almost like learns it as like a second nature, almost like riding a bike, if you will, right? Like, you in theory learn how to ride a bike and then don't forget it, but the same could potentially be true for some of these different exercises and movement patterns and other things that we use as strength and conditioning professionals day in and day out that way. It's like, if you accumulate tens of thousands of reps over several years that way, it almost becomes like a second nature to the person that way. I think that also makes the importance of, you mentioned before about quality, so important as well. And you mentioned mechanics earlier as well. It's like, the things that we do early on right now with these kids could set them up for great success the rest of their life. Or we could just, decide, you know what, I'm too busy or I'm too tired. I'm not going to look at the mechanics or I'm not going to worry about this or that because, so and so on Instagram said it doesn't matter. But it's like, those things do because it's harder to break those habits after they've done tens of thousands of reps of them. It's a lot easier when it's early on and fresh. So I think getting in there, making a difference, and then just repeating that same stimulus over and over and over again for a long time until it becomes second nature to the athlete. Again, because once it's second nature to them and they don't forget it, it's like it feels easier. And maybe I didn't word that the best, but like, again, it's like they can go back in and do things that maybe they aren't doing every single day, but it doesn't feel as taxing as it did when they were first learning how to do it, if you will.
Yeah, and I think that that starts to get into like the what is developmentally appropriate conversation because, I think a lot of times there's so much pressure in strength and conditioning to like show results, show results. So like we have to have this like 6 inch gain in a vertical and this, that. And so people will throw mechanics by the wayside to go chase improvement. And I'm like, that's not development. Like I can go have kids, and I'm currently in a conversation with an athlete and her previous trainer or whatever it was, like had her hooked up to Vertimax and doing all these high box jumps and that kind of stuff. And she comes in and I'm like watching her land and I'm like, yeah, that's not what we're gonna do, right? And so I've had to show her kind of like some videos of like I've shown her the graphics on hip displacement and talked her through that. And now I'm videoing her form because it's like, yeah, I want you to improve. I want your vertical to increase, but we're not going to go chase that at the expense of your development, at the expense of your safety, at the expense of your health. And I think that too often people are starting to, you look at sprints, it's like, okay, yeah, like everybody's all big into timing sprints. Great. I time sprints as well because it drives intent, right? It makes kids run faster because they're timed and they want to beat their time. Like you can do the same thing with racing and that kind of stuff. But if they're sprinting with horrible technique, like are we accomplishing what we set out to accomplish? Probably not. So I think that there has to be a really big focus on how we do things versus just what output we get out of things.
100% agree. And it's like, if you throw that form to the wayside, like, unfortunately, I've seen athletes get injured during strength and conditioning. And if you want to piss off a head coach real quick, get them hurt in the weight room. Because not only will the coach be calling them, but parents will be calling them. The kid's trusting you is probably going to be a little bit hurt. There's just nothing good comes from that. So I completely echo that point. I'm curious, taking everything that you've, learned up to this point and everything we've talked about so far, if you had to kind of like give a sample week of what a conditioning program with you would look like for maybe that in-season versus out-of-season athlete, assuming that, maybe they didn't keep up to date with everything that they should be doing out of season. What does that typical week look like for you, knowing that they're practicing, knowing that they might have a set of matches or something of that sort that way? Just like a sample conditioning program, if you will, that way.
Yeah, so if we're in season and they have not had an off season that prepared them for that, we're gonna not condition because they're gonna have to practice and they're gonna have to compete. And again, we're not gonna stack, like, you can't make up for lost time. That's why it's called lost time. And I think that if more people took that approach, we would have less athletes killed in training session and conditioning sessions in the early stages of training, which is when it happens. But if we have, structured things correctly in the off season, it's really going to depend. So like I was programming for an NAIA school this season, and so we went with, they were playing a Thursday, Friday, Saturday games. Sunday was their off day. So it's like we have Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Thursday being a travel day very often. So we would put just a little bit of higher intensity conditioning on Monday at the end of practice. And then we would either have a lower intensity conditioning session on Tuesday to facilitate some recovery from that, or on Wednesday. All right. It would just depend on like kind of how she was structuring practice that week. In the high school setting, like I said, I would use a lower intensity conditioning session on Saturday mornings after a game. If you have non-starters that aren't playing, but you've always got to be on the bench, you have to have your bench ready for the end of the season if somebody gets hurt. Those kids would need to do a higher intensity conditioning session the day after a game. So either a Wednesday, or they could do an additional one on Saturday just to make sure that they're not getting the same number of reps on the court. So we need to give them some type of stimulus to keep them in shape deep into the season. Which that one kind of gets into, we've really got to, and I program that in for the collegiate athletes that I was working with this year as well, where it was like, hey, like, coach, you're going to have this conversation with kids, because sometimes kids don't like it. They're like, man, I already don't play and that sucks. And now you're making me do hard stuff on the top of, because I don't play. They don't like that. So you have to have the conversation of, this is why we're doing it. We're doing it to keep you ready in case your number gets called. In the off season, let's talk about summer, because club just throws a wrench into everything, right? But if in the off season, I structure my training week as a Monday through Thursday, because I want my kids to go to the lake and go to the pool and be kids for a 3-day weekend. And you know who else likes a 3-day weekend? Me. So we go Monday through Thursday. Monday is like a speed and power day, along with our lower body lift. I know people don't like to lift in training splits, but if you're going in 4 days, we're lifting in a training split. So sorry if that hurts anybody's feelings. And then at the end of that session, we'll do some deep tier plyos as conditioning. Which, pro tip, don't do deep tier plyos as conditioning with your team in an act of solidarity the first time, because you'll do it the rest of the summer, no matter how tired you are. Learn that lesson. Tuesday, that's going to be our upper body lift. And then we're going to do either an aerobic mobility circuit or cardiac output circuit, just something lower intensity. Again, facilitate recovery, because Wednesday is going to be a high day again. We will then use, deep tier plyos at the end of that. Thursday, the end of the session, we're going to taste blood. We use short intensive tempos. So generally we'll start at a 10-second on, 50-second off. We'll do 3 to 6 reps per set with about a 3-minute break in between. I'll also use Derek Hansen's 10 by 10. We'll start with like 2 sets of that and then progress up to 4 sets. So just getting that higher intensity stimulus. Running is not necessarily specific to volleyball, but again, back to the practicality piece. I don't necessarily want to do deep tier plyos 4 days in a row. And we don't have like a row of echo bikes in our facility. So running is what it is, because that's what works for our space.
Yeah, no, and I think that's a great point as well, is ultimately you have to figure out what works for your space. I like that kind of approach though, that you program for the 4-day week. And I like that high-low model that you program as well that way. And earlier, you also mentioned about the importance of numbers and assessments, and how a lot of times strength coaches feel they need to show something that shows the kids are making progress that way. Do you have any kind of like assessment type tools that you like for, conditioning or endurance assessment, if you will? Are you making your kids run the beep test or something along those lines, or?
Yeah, so I did not do a conditioning test with them last summer. I have used a beep test in the past just because extremely scalable.
Hmm.
Kids have done it a million times so they understand it. And then there is a ton of normative data out there on it.
Hmm.
And it's been shown to be valid and reliable and all that kind of stuff at predicting aerobic fitness. I put together kind of a modified phosphate recovery test last year, and did a dry run, did a couple dry runs with my kids, and they loved it. So basically, the I think the true test is like 7 reps, where it's 7 seconds on, 23 seconds off of a straight line run, and then they turn around and start the next rep on the 30-second mark. I modified it to basically they're on a down and it's looking at performance decrement. So the distance covered in the first rep versus the distance covered in the seventh rep. I modified that to put it on a court. So they basically like sprint down, touch the serving line, sprint back, and then I've got cones set up every 1.5 meters, because the court's a 9 by 9 meter box. So every 1.5 meter, and then they've got a partner saying like, okay, you hit cone for this rep, and then we just record every rep, and then we can calculate their drop off at the end. Like I've got a little spreadsheet where we can look at the performance decrement and whatnot. And the kid the first like 4 reps, everybody was like, this is the easiest conditioning ever. And then all of a sudden, like the jelly legs set in, and like I do 8 reps to make it a clean 4 minutes. I don't have to think about what rep we're on. I just know when 4 minutes is over on the stopwatch, we're done. To make it simple on me, because again, like things have to be scalable. So I really like using that one because that's going to give you an assessment of like anaerobic capacity, right? Like how can we repeat a high output on a relatively short rest interval, because volleyball is about a 7 to 14 second average play with about a 15-second rest interval between points. So as far as specificity gets, I think that that's probably going to get as close as you can. I mean, it's hard to, put together. I initially tried a conditioning test where there was like some shuffling and all this stuff, but like the more changes of direction that you add in there, the more it becomes a little bit skill based and less conditioning based.
Yeah, no. Welcome back to another episode of the Braun Performance and Rehab Podcast, powered by ISOFIT, Oro Muscles, and Firefly Recovery. ISOFIT is my go-to for all things isometric strength training. For more on ISOFIT, be sure to check out isofit.com. Oro Muscles revolutionizes rehabilitation with real-time actionable insights into muscle activity with live biofeedback and instant analysis, which has made a huge impact in my work with athletes. For more on Oro, be sure to check out oromuscles.com. Episodes like this are made possible by Firefly, the official recovery provider of the Braun Performance and Rehab Podcast. For more on Firefly, be sure to check out recoveryfirefly.com. Be sure to check out isofit.com. Oro Muscles revolutionizes rehabilitation with real-time actionable insights into muscle activity with live biofeedback and instant analysis, which has made a huge impact in my work with athletes. For more on Oro, be sure to check out oromuscles.com. Episodes like this are made possible by Firefly, the official recovery provider of the Braun Performance and Rehab Podcast. For more on Firefly, be sure to check out recoveryfirefly.com.
Prioritize speed, power, and strength. I think that, volleyball in particular, this is changing, but you had this long standing, like we just, to your point of doing 500 reps of bands, like that's it. We're just going to tie a band to the net and do external rotation and like then do some conditioning circuits, and we're going to call it in some plyos and call it good. So make sure that you're prioritizing speed, power, and strength, whether you're implementing a conditioning program or not. And then also just look at your context and see what fits in best for your athletes and design your conditioning program around that.
Yeah, no, I love that. I love that a lot. And as you mentioned earlier, you have a ton of great resources for the coach and the athlete alike that way. For people who want to find out more about you, where can they find you at online and all?
Easiest thing is my website, MissyMitchell-McBeth.com. You can also look me up on Instagram or Twitter. I'm fairly active on both. Missy M. McBeth is my handle.
Awesome. We'll link to that in the description below as well. That way, if you didn't quite catch it, you can just click there and see everything that Missy is up to. This was awesome. Really appreciate your time today, Missy.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.